and it was a big coach, and I converted it into a restaurant, and we called it the No Bucks Cafe, as in Starbucks, except no bucks. And we used their logo. How we weren't jailed, I don't know.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 167 for the 23rd of November 2023. I listen to podcasts quite a bit in arrears. I'm not too worried about being current, I suppose. And I was just listening to a David McWilliams podcast from August, and he was talking about the banks. Not too surprising. And he touched on a topic that I'm surprised more people don't discuss. David McWilliams didn't really discuss the topic that I'm referring to, but he did kind of arrive at the topic. This goes all the way back to Marx, the Communist Manifesto and all that, and the workers seizing the means of production. Whatever about my other views, I think this misunderstands how economies work. Firstly, that whole thing about the workers seizing the means of production, whenever it's been put into effect, or even tried to be, it inevitably means the state seizing the means of production, nationalising industries. This was a cornerstone of left-wing policy around the world up to about the 1970s, but became a bit taboo after that, especially in the West, not least because of how badly nationalised industries performed. When Mary Robinson was running for president in 1990, there were a few desperate Fianna Fáil attempts to throw back at her statements that she had made in the 1960s advocating nationalising the banks. So it was particularly ironic that another 20 years later, in 2010, it was Fianna Fáil that ended up effectively nationalising the banks, and the Labour Party was the only significant party in the Dáil that voted against the bank bailout that led directly to that nationalisation. But history, or at least the observations of a pop economist, is proving that, well, I suppose they were both right and both wrong, but Fianna Fáil were right first.
Irish banks are the worst performing in the whole of Europe at passing on increases in interest rates to savers. They've only passed on 7% of each increase to the saver. In contrast, the banks in the UK, and I know we give the UK a hard time every now and then, right? But the banks in the UK have passed on 43% of all those interest rate hikes.
The bottom line there is that the Irish public are being hosed by Irish banks. But hang on a minute, Irish banks were, and to an extent still are, nationalised. Haven't the workers seized the means of production already? This exposes why the Marxist analysis doesn't work. The government, the people, can regulate an industry, or they can own an industry, but they can't do both. It is a fundamental conflict of interest. And the reality is that, yes, the state is the collective will of the people, but it's naive to imagine that it doesn't have an independent existence itself. Yes, there are people who have the best interests of the people at heart working for government. They have them at heart most of the time, at least. Also, there are people who only think of their own interests, but the state, like any other institution, has a collective sense of self-preservation and promoting its own interests. And if the state owns a huge chunk of the banking sector, it is inevitable that the desire to accrue profits from that ownership comes into conflict with regulating that sector, protecting the consumers, the public, who need its services. And it's pretty clear which side is winning in that conflict.
So what the bank is doing, it's taking your money in, it's giving you 1%, It's depositing that money at the central bank at 4.5%, and it's trousering the 3% in the middle, which is yours.
And it isn't just the savers who are getting ripped off. So when you hear about the record profits of Irish banks, don't imagine that it's some sort of business acumen, some sort of talent at running an enterprise that is making those profits. They make those profits because they have us over a barrel. In a free market, the solution to this problem would be competition. Someone sees that Irish banks are making an absolute killing, and they say that they'd like a piece of that action too, and they set up shop, bringing in more competition to the market and thereby lowering prices. In a business with a lot of state regulation, which banking kind of has to be, you'd expect the regulator to step in and prevent the banks from making supernormal profits at the expense of their captive market. But when the government is both the owner and the regulator, and motivated not to make it easy for competition to enter the market, and motivated not to lessen their own profits by preventing overcharging, neither of those two solutions is possible. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. We're being ripped off. We own the banks and they're still ripping us off.
The Irish banks have, in the last 5 years, charged on average 1.5% more than any other European bank for loans. Now, analysts have said that this probably is costing the Irish economy about 120 million euros a month.
I'm not saying that every nationalised industry is always worse in every case than every privatised one. It's true that our telephone service is bad, but it's light years ahead of where it was when it was run by the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, even allowing for the development of technology. But without the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, it's doubtful we would have got a telephone service at all when we did. But many businesses are just too big and too complex for the consumer to have any chance when they go head to head with them. So there needs to be some sort of government-sponsored regulation. And as I said, even if it's the government, the owner can't be the regulator without having a major conflict of interest. And experience shows that conflict is not resolved in favour of the consumer. But that's not the only problem.
For example, the central bank estimated in 2018 that only 8,400 Irish mortgage holders had seen their homes repossessed. It's an incredibly low figure given that there was about 100,000 mortgages in default.
Right, okay.
So of those in default, only 8% were ever actually reclaimed by the banks, right? It takes, on average in Ireland, even those ones that were foreclosed on, 81 months for the process to actually work. This compares to 18 months in the UK, Denmark, right, Norway, Sweden, 24 months in Finland. Now, what this means, John, what all this means is that foreign banks look at Ireland and they say, okay, that is a country where, yes, you can make loads of money, but in the event of a crash, you will never, ever recover your money. So the risk premium in Ireland, the actual risk premium is very, very high. So because the foreign banks look at the repossession dynamics and they say, if Ireland hits the buffers, we'll end up in court without being able to get our money back. So that's why they're not coming in.
The massive margins that the banks are taking from their customers, both savers and borrowers, they aren't actually all going back into bank profits. As we hear there, banks need to make fatter margins in order to cover the fact that, much more than in other countries, they often don't get their money back. Nobody wants to be throwing people out of their homes, but the fact is, if your neighbour doesn't pay their mortgage, then you pay it. And your neighbour is likely to go knocking on the door of the local TD and say how they don't want to be thrown out on the side of the road. And when the bank that is doing the throwing out is state-owned, that could well be an effective way to avoid repossession for people who, for whatever reason, don't pay their mortgage. There are lots of problems with our banks. A lot of them touch on the housing market, but I'm sorry to say that you shouldn't imagine that solving those problems will in any way solve the housing crisis or even make housing more affordable. It won't. That's not to say we shouldn't solve those problems, but we should be aware that for every euro saved by customers on their mortgage payments, that's another euro that house prices will go up, because demand for housing is so inelastic and supply of housing is so restricted. So that's a problem for another day. In a moment, we'll have the interview, but first, I just want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, but we really appreciate when people sign up. It's a big morale boost. It shows us that people are listening and appreciating the podcast, and it pays for things like web hosting and phone bills. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a Mars bar once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Tiglin is a charity that provides services to homeless people, and its founder and chairman, Aubrey McCarthy, is on the line now. Aubrey, what does Tiglin do exactly?
So Tiglin was set up in 2008 to help people that were suffering from substance abuse, life-controlling issues. Mm-hmm. And since then, we have gone into a lot more social enterprise housing, transitional housing, and a lot of services for homelessness.
And give me an idea of the size of the charity. What's your sort of, I guess, turnover, you might say? How many people do you help per year?
Okay, at the moment we have 7 centres and we have approximately 200 people in our care, residential care, on any one day. We're feeding between 300 and 500 every day on the streets of Dublin through our Lighthouse Cafe.
And how do you raise money? Is that small donations? Is that business donations? Or do you get government funding?
We actually work with the government regarding the rehab centres, and we also work with the Department of Social Protection to provide community employment schemes. Our homeless outreach is 100% funded by ourselves, and it's literally grown organically. So I don't know how long we'll be able to continue doing it without support.
Okay. One thing, because I guess if you weren't at the beginning, you must now be an expert in homelessness. I'm not sure that's a good thing, but let's use that expertise in any case. And one of the things, and you mentioned there, drug addiction issues. And one of the observations I might have had visiting big cities around the world, the New Yorks, the Londons, Paris and Berlin and whatever, is that typically, or for at least a certain profile of people, homelessness is not a housing shortage issue. It is more of a mental health issue, more of an addiction issue. In the main, and I'm going to come to the other side of that in a moment, but in the main, would that be correct in your experience?
William, you have hit the nail on the head, and I've been saying that for 10 years. I had to speak to the joint houses of the Oireachtas on this very issue when Simon Coveney was housing minister. So you have absolutely summed it up.
Okay, and I guess you are talking about having 200 people that are in your care, I guess, in your type of housing. What sort of services are you giving them, or what is it that prevents them from ending up on the streets?
So if you can imagine, tonight we'll have our cafe open, and let's say there's 100 people at a time inside. If you come in and you offer me 100 houses, that won't solve the homeless issue. What it will do, it'll be a temporary fix, but unless there are supported services such as mental health services, employment services, training, education, etc., it's only a temporary fix. So my idea is housing first is a wonderful model, but it must accompany the supports such as what Tiglin has done. And ironically, when we started Tiglin, we started off with a small cohort of 30 people that we were helping. But that has grown because we found gaps. We found that the people that came to us looking for help for substance misuse, they had no education. So we found that, well, they're not going to get a job unless they have education. So we got people into college. Then we found that they'd no housing. They couldn't go back to the very place that they got sick in the first place. So if you're from Drogheda and you were using drugs in Drogheda, you can't really go back to Drogheda when you're sober. So what we've tried to do is enter in transitional housing. So we've done a lot of that. Then also a lot of people perhaps don't want to get into education or don't have the aptitude for it. So we've opened up various social enterprises. And one of them in particular, Rise at the Cove and Greystones, that recently won Social Enterprise of the Year. And it's bringing the community in to the guys, the girls that come through our programs. And yet it is phenomenally successful. And it's people come and they buy the coffee off us, not because they want to support a charity, because it's bloody good coffee. And we've then set up a bakery recently, and the bakery employs people that come to our services, and we then pay them for the products and we sell them in the markets and in our cafe. So all in all, it's a circular economy. But once again, it's housing with huge supports surrounding it.
Give me a typical profile of a success story.
Oh, right. trying to narrow it down to one. I'm gonna mention one guy in particular. He was homeless. He came to our services, and William, when I was setting up the homeless services, I bought a bus, and it was a big coach, and I converted it into a restaurant, and we called it the No Bucks Cafe, as in Starbucks, except no bucks. And we used their logo. How we weren't jailed, I don't know. But anyway, I got a bus license and I pulled up outside Cleary's Clock 4 days a week. And for some reason, the homeless, they liked what we did. One of the guys that came on board, himself and his twin brother, they came on board, and his name was Alan and Jay. Wonderful guys. They were living rough in Stephen's Green, and then they used to joke that they had a weekend house in the Phoenix Park because they'd get out of the city for the weekend. So Alan said he wanted to get into journalism. So I actually said, okay, let's get him into a course. We got him into Colosta Dulig in Coolock. He was still homeless on the streets. Unfortunately, he failed it, and it was a level 5, which is fairly minimal. So but for him it was huge, but he failed it. So I got in touch with his lecturer and I just explained, I said, listen, this guy's living in adverse circumstances. Can we bend the rules, make allowances, give him support? And I got a call back and said, absolutely not. Academia is academia. So I was totally disappointed. But I went on LinkedIn, and William, I came across a guy called Dr. Joe Collins, who worked with SETU, Southeast Technological University. I sold him the story and I just said, this guy, himself and his brother, they need help in education. Do you know, last Christmas, Simon Harris, the Minister for Education, Higher Education, gave an Academic Excellence Award to both of the brothers. They're now on their second master's degree. So I just go, here's a guy with no supports and he failed level 5. Here's a guy with housing supports and other supports, and now he's kicking the ball out of the park and he's on his second master's degree.
Is there sort of a hole in our system, or holes in the net that people fall through, that, you know, people who go through life and they get different opportunities, maybe somebody doesn't quite get that and their life can spiral down? You can think that is very inconvenient for society. It might just cost a lot of money, but even if you weren't to consider the money a priority, having somebody failing that badly in society is not a good thing for the whole of society. Are we missing something whereby we have, you know, a solution that is relatively cheap compared to not having a solution?
I would say so. And I'll give you an example. You look at Joe Malone. In our educational system, we have a cookie cutter approach. We have one size fits all. I'm excited with aspects such as the Trinity Access program. That's phenomenal. But we need more of that. And Joe Collins, he's coming up with ideas how to bring ordinary people into the education
Who is Joe
system.
Collins?
But Joe Collins is a professor from SETU. So he's Dr. Joe Collins, a wonderful man. But I mentioned Joe Malone. Joe Malone wasn't known, and she was in school and she was considered a bit thick. because she wasn't able to fit in and do well in school. So her teachers used to slag her and all the rest. Jo Malone was on a school trip one day and she was out in the woods with the teacher and she was able to smell a particular type of rose. And then she smelled a particular type of other rose. And the teacher was flabbergasted at this and said, wow. So Jo Malone set up Jo Malone Perfume and become a gazillionaire. So the educational system focused on her academic achievements, but she was marvelously clever and intelligent in the area of smell. So it's a case of finding out what is the individual good at. As Einstein said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, that fish will be stupid forever. So with Tig Lin, we focus on the individual and we find out where do the talents lie. You know, when the person comes in, even if it's for substance misuse, we don't start off with, okay, how many drugs are you on? Have you a criminal record? Have you got family? We start off with, what are your dreams? What are your aspirations? Where do you want to be in 2 years' time? And then we have a program that works around that. So I would say trying to believe in the person and get the person to believe in themselves. That's huge in education.
Okay. One thing I want to ask you is because, as I mentioned, frequently homelessness, especially in the type of scenario that you're describing there, isn't really a lack of housing issue. It is perhaps an issue with life chances and with addiction and perhaps mental health as well. But Ireland, I think, is unique in that we have people who are homeless, perhaps not living on the streets, although perhaps sometimes they are, because of the actual lack of a house. And we have, and I was looking at these figures recently, the lowest number of houses, of dwellings per 1,000 people by far in the developed economies. And we have, and that figure is going down because the rate of house building compared to the rate of the increase in the population is not keeping up. Have you encountered that issue, and is that within your remit of people who are homeless, not because of external issues, but just because there aren't enough houses out there?
You know, when we started the homeless outreach in 2006, we started the homeless outreach, but the cohort, the demographics have changed radically. And now you are quite likely to get a William or an Aubrey coming in who actually is an economic homeless person. It's not because of an addiction. It's not because of mental health. It's actually because you couldn't make the mortgage. And you actually lost your house. Or perhaps you in 2008, during the mad times, perhaps you invested and the investments went wrong. And now you cannot afford your own house. So I'm finding ordinary people, lads, girls who don't have any mental health or drug issues, and they're finding themselves homeless. But I will say what is frustrating to me, because I'm involved in the homelessness sector, I look at the amount of houses, the amount of apartments over shops all around Dublin. I look at Jury's Hotel in Ballsbridge. I look at the Baggot Street Hospital. I look at all of these places and I go, gee, I wonder, is it through lack of supply or is it just without a vision people perish?
I think you're right. I guess I would take it from what you're saying that you accept that those are two entirely separate issues, and that Ireland, maybe not unique, but Ireland is certainly an outlier in having people who are not, failing, or I don't want to be pejorative about it, but, who do not have life issues in the way that is typical of homelessness in a lot of, especially big urban centres. Would you agree Ireland really is an outlier in having otherwise competent, functioning individuals ending up either homeless or perhaps very, very marginally housed, sleeping on somebody's sofas, having to move back in with elderly parents, that sort of thing? That's really startling, isn't it?
My housing officer, now she since moved on, but she rang me there about 6 months ago and she said, her name is Jessica, and she said, Aubrey, my landlord is selling his house because he was in with a vulture fund, they took over, he couldn't afford it, and he's selling. So he's given me notice. I have tried daft.ie, I've tried myhome.ie, I've tried them all. I cannot get a place. So technically, my housing officer was being made homeless and there's nothing we could do. Now, thank God she found a place and that all worked out. But how quickly that could have turned wrong, and therefore the housing officer for the homeless agency is homeless herself. Mm-hmm. I mean, if that's not a paradox.
And we have seen, perhaps more on the left, I've heard some politicians say, we don't have a housing crisis, we have a rental crisis. Now, there are issues around, rental stability, like the sort of thing that you're talking about. Do you feel competent to comment, and you might say no, but do you feel competent to comment that extreme mismatch between supply and demand in the housing sector is creating a second sort of housing that is pretty much unknown in the Western world? And I guess my secondary question is, can that then spill over into that primary type of homelessness that you previously described?
And it can. And as I said at the start, my business, my primary business is moving. So we move people all over the world. And recently I was moving an economist from Dublin, and he was working with the European Union, but he was based in Dublin. Do you know where he's going? He's going to Brussels because he cannot afford Dublin. And he's on a significant salary. So I just thought, if the economist can't afford Dublin, we're in trouble. So I will say that has happened over the last number of years. It's like we took our eye off the ball. We focused on everything else. When COVID happened, we had all the departments getting together to sit down to solve COVID. When the Ukrainian crisis broke out, we had all the departments. We came up with wonderful solutions. They're not doing the same when it comes to housing and homelessness. I know there's wonderful lip service, and I know certain politicians are doing their best, but I will say there's not the same drive or motivation. And I often think of Michael D. before he was president. When he was in the Dáil, he quoted Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, and he said there should be a floor through which nobody should be allowed to fall, whether that's in health or housing. But he said the test of your citizenship is your ability to participate in society without shame. I'm seeing every day people coming in with their heads bowed into our homeless Lighthouse Cafe on Pier Street. And some of them, they don't come for food. Some of them, they don't come for hot food meal. Some of them come for their groceries. So we've opened up now shelves along the side of the entrance, and you come in and you can get your potatoes, you can get your carrots and all the rest, and then you can go home. So these people aren't homeless that are coming for their groceries. They're just people that are economically in trouble.
Okay. And I think sometimes, you can comment on this if you want, that it is unhelpful to public discourse that those two different things are mixed up or combined under a single heading, and people, can feel, if for whatever reason they can't stay in the rented accommodation that they're in, that they are homeless and that their issue is being mixed up with other people who have completely different issues. And you said that the politicians don't seem to be able to get themselves in gear to deal with that. There are some sections of the population whom it suits very well for this crisis to happen. Are you sure that it's not that the politicians are reluctant to solve it because people who they're friends with not only do not suffer, but actually benefit?
Okay, there is debate over that. And, there's a lot of people that are house owners and landlords, etc. Some of them by default, it just happened because they got married, etc. And then they had to move out of their apartment. They couldn't sell it and they ended up renting it. So you deal with a lot of that. But I think what you're saying is few and far between. I wouldn't say that is the major issue behind the housing crisis. I get there are some people, and you see these vulture funds when they're buying the likes of Isaac's Hostel and places like that, and you realize, wow, this was
near the train station. Near Connolly Station was a tourist hostel for a long time. Yeah,
and you see vulture funds coming in and buying full housing estates. So then William and Aubrey don't.
But hold on, Aubrey, is that the cause or the symptom? Because those guys who are running vulture funds, they do their research. They're playing with billions, not millions, and that to me signals that they have done their research and they believe that the political situation is such that that asset will remain at a highly inflated value. You can't, you can, but it doesn't do you any good, blaming vulture funds or, international finance for reacting to policy decisions made by politicians. Surely it makes more sense to look at the decisions themselves.
I will say that in the last while they have changed the rules regarding buying full housing estates, etc. You're not allowed to buy more than X amount of units. So there has been protest, there has been a change in that area. But I also will say, in order to work and sort of solve the homeless crisis, come down to our cafe any day of the week. And I think good leaders, they have to have empathy and they have to understand what's going on in the lives of the individuals that are suffering and then break through that. So all of the issues that you raised, including whether or not it's a clever way of keeping house prices high, etc., that all can be dealt with. We need to break through that by focusing on the people who are affected.
I don't doubt that that's true. I do think, however, that if you started going around knocking on doors telling people, yeah, we're going to make sure that your kids are able to buy a house, and the way that we're going to do that is by making your house worth a third of what it is now, I'm not entirely sure how many votes you would get. But I think the core problem there is that Ireland is obsessed with property, and the people who are settled and live in a house that they own are inherently a larger voting bloc than the people who aren't. And the people who are forced to emigrate are inherently not a voting bloc at all. And, if you take any appeal against any apartment block being built, you will see a whole sort of discourse around what do the local residents think their views should be taken into account. I just think our society is sort of set up in a way that their views are inherently viewed as more important than the theoretical people who don't exist in the real sense that would live in the apartment block. Nobody consults them. And I just kind of want to compare it to, and you said that you receive state funding for various activities, and I haven't a word of criticism for you, but I'm not sure that's the best policy. I mean, I think it's true with your charity and quite a few others that a lot of them are becoming essentially what the Catholic Church became in the early years of the state, that the state is outsourcing its responsibility to provide services. Those services are still being in full funded by the taxpayer. And are you sure that that's the best model?
It's 15 years since we started off, and it's only in the last few that we've got funding. So really, Tiglin, and I'm only speaking from our side, has provided services to the state that has changed and impacted thousands of lives. But not only that, it's then resulted in productive members of society coming into the workplace.
I'm not disputing the benefit of what you do, not one bit, but I'm just wondering, and you're not the decision maker on this, but you are sort of participating in a system whereby the state can provide these services, or can at least foot the bill for these services at arm's length. And I'm wondering, is that the best model?
I suppose, I had addiction in my own family, and it was fairly chaotic, William. So when I started to make a few quid, I just said, I wonder, can I make a difference in this area? So I'm not the best. I went to government first, and they said, no, do not set this up. Mm-hmm. And it's like watching an old woman fall across the street. You don't look up the theory. You don't get in touch with the department. You go over and you pick her up. So that's really what we did. So a lot of it has been naive. And if I knew what was involved, I perhaps wouldn't have got involved, because there's a lot to go with it. And I'm a volunteer chairman. But I spoke I had to address both houses of the Oireachtas a number of years ago. And I spoke about the solution to housing, and I mentioned supports. And I brought in a guy who actually was homeless. And when we met him, he's in addiction. He had been given 3 different houses by the state, 2 apartments and a house. And each one of those he botched up. He left the door open. He set it on fire. He forgot to pay the bills. The council boarded it up, etc. I had him in there as a guest of mine who was now married, who has now had his own mortgage, and he was back working in society. So I'm saying there's a bit, if we can do it with one, we can do it with many. So the supports for housing need to be given. Don't just throw money and keep building houses, certainly for the cohort of people that we deal with.
Sure. But for example, we had, I'm not suggesting that this is analogous to yourself, but, in the early years of the state and up to relatively recently within living memory, you had that funding model, which was essentially used to then fund the Magdalen laundries and so forth. And I don't dispute or question your intentions or your probity. But what I'm questioning is, and you don't answer for the state, but is that the optimal way the state should do that? Wouldn't it be better that all of the services that you do should be done essentially under a process that is accessible to democratic control?
100%, absolutely. And somebody recently said to me, Aubrey, if somebody came along, let's say the state, and they opened up a rehab centre, and it was next door to Tiglin, what would you do? And I said, I would, if they could do a better job, if they could work with the homeless better than what we're doing, you give them the keys, because this isn't something that we're doing to keep ourselves busy. This is something we're doing because there's a gap here, and it's not being provided for. You know, we are the only nighttime service indoors. There's a number of super ovens for the homeless, but we're the only nighttime service that is open Monday to Sunday on the streets of Dublin. And now I will say the DHRE have come on board, and Dublin City Council paid for one staff member. But recently I hired a guy to run it, and I've been doing it for years, but he now runs it. He was homeless himself. He was a service user. And one thing he said, during the evenings, he had to walk the boardwalk until he could get back into his hostel. Okay, so what he did when he took over, he changed my building. It was white and it was sort of institutional. He changed it to lime green. He's put up these cane baskets of chandeliers all over the place. He's got funky chairs. Now on a Friday night, he does a cinema night for the homeless. On a Thursday, he has a comedy night. On a Wednesday, he has barber and bingo. On Tuesday, it's karaoke. And he's turned it into nearly a hub for the homeless. And the fact that you're homeless is nearly incidental. So he's really making it a place whereby it's trendy is a wrong word, but people that are vulnerable and in need can enjoy a night out while also getting much needed services.
What do you think of proposals to legalise and or decriminalise some drugs?
I was speaking at the Citizens Assembly 2 weeks ago, and there was different people talking, and I had to address maintaining resilience and recovery and things like that, and about the Tiglin model. And they were focusing on the legalization and the decriminalization. There's a vast difference between the two.
Yep.
But one guy got up, and I've always said I would hate if one of my members of my family became a criminal because of something they couldn't help and give up. So this guy got up, and he actually has a very fancy job and all the rest. He spoke about that, and he's done very well. But he said he was caught with drugs. I'm not too sure what it was. And he said that sent him to prison and got him into this prison system. And he said that's where he hit rock bottom, and he realized he had to change. So in that sense, it worked very well. And by getting into the criminal justice system, he got sober and he changed his life. I should interject. It's some years old, but I do remember coming across the figure that 50% of the heroin addicts in Ireland got hooked on heroin while they were in prison. Yeah, there's a huge drug problem in prison, absolutely. But I was just talking about that guy in particular, and he spoke about his experience. Whereas I would have always been saying, "Oh, I want it to be a health-led approach." It wasn't the health-led approach that sobered him. So I just go, there's two sides to it. Now they had they published the findings of the Citizens Assembly, and they are focusing on a health-led approach. And to me, focusing on helping the individual rather than criminalizing them, that's where my heart is.
Okay. You give a politician-style answer that doesn't seem to offend anybody there, and is has a tone of trying to have broad appeal. I know you ran in the by-election for the Trinity Shannon seat last year. You did, for a first time run, you did relatively respectively. You got 7%. You came in at, I think, 6th out of a large field. Might you be running in something else again?
When I was asked to run for that, it came from very left of field and right of field. There was people asking me to run. I had no idea what it would involve. But I will say, nobody really knows what I've done. I've always been I've kept my head down, just get it done and get the job done. So with the Shannon, you nearly have to go out and say, I did this and I did that. Not the most comfortable feeling. But I will say at the hustings, they spoke about housing. And they were the question, and I was able to speak what we've done in housing. They spoke about women's refuge, health and education. They spoke about the climate. I had involved myself by default in all of those aspects. So I was able to speak about absolute experience and achievements in those areas. And so that really was comfortable. I found it exciting, probably that's a bit strange, and I met the most wonderful people. But also,
again, you're not quite answering the question of whether you're going to be running for any other office.
I was asked would I run as a TD or a councillor. That wouldn't be me. It wouldn't be me. The Senate is coming around again. Maybe I will do that. It'll depend on the time. But I don't think the mainstream politics. I don't think so.
Okay, Aubrey McCarthy, entrepreneur and founder of everything from restaurants to removals companies, and chairman of Tiglin, the homelessness charity. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Aubrey McCarthy at Aubrey McCarthy, and get in touch with us if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, and if you could throw in the price of a Mars bar or even the price of a selection box once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.